Kia ora, Deb Bailey. I am pretty stoked to chat to you today. I love chatting to you all the time, right? I think it's just a bonus that people get to listen into us this time around because we get to talk about some really cool stuff, you and I. Similar backgrounds, both in Tamaki Makaurau, both kind of done the HR thing previously in a kind of distant past, and both do similar stuff now around writing books and speaking and helping leaders and teams be their best. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, Jess. Always good to talk with you as well.
Yeah, totally. I know we've had a few chats in the since Christmas about, what's new for 2024, what's changed. And I know that, we've done this work for quite a few years, and yet things seem to be different, particularly in the last couple of years than maybe the last 8 or 9. What are you noticing out there that's changing? What are some of the challenges that we're facing now that's perhaps different to a few years ago?
Yeah, such a good question. So the key changes that I'm seeing that actually started probably about midway through last year, where they were sort of coming up more and more in conversation when I was working with leaders and their teams, was just actually around, still how do I have more impact in my own leadership, but also how do I navigate this whole team sort of dynamic now? How do I lead effectively with the new ways of work? So a lot of leaders are having to deal with team members who are working remotely. So they may not even be in the same city as them. It could be anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world, even.
Mhm.
That hybrid working. So some in the office, some away, not all necessarily together at the same time. And we know that organizations have been really grappling with their work from home policies, and some are mandating, and others are still trying to navigate their way through that flexibility. So I've seen a lot in that space, and I guess specifically because that's quite broad. I've had a lot of questions around how do I maintain sort of connection, engagement, and sort of momentum with my team members. How do we maintain our shared sense of identity, that we don't lose that, because we're just not all together in the same place like we were. Um, and another one's been around, how can I help my team members navigate the change process itself, but the impact of change as well. Not everybody adapts to change that easily. As human beings, we tend to be creatures of certainty, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the one thing that we know since COVID has been that, I mean, change was always the constant, but it seems like it's even more so now.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I really feel for a lot of leaders at the moment, because they're really trying to grapple and do their best for their teams, for their organizations in this space. But that's what I'm hearing. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And I'd say the same. I think it's really interesting because, like you say, things like change have always happened, always been around, but it seems more almost like they're under a magnifying glass. It seems bigger. And I think you're right. That's off the back of the pandemic and COVID. And I almost feel like there's a change fatigue because there's been so many big changes over the last few years that it's almost like we're kind of up to here. And then, we've got a cost of living crisis and economic uncertainty, which is causing a lot of cuts. We're seeing restructures this year as a result of just how drastically our businesses have had to change over the last few years. And you're right, some people are just so fatigued with change they can't do anymore. And I think it's different. We've always had restructures, but it's different if you're staring down the barrel of economic uncertainty, cost of living crisis, and potential job insecurity. And then, of course, you've got all these human factors that are part of our life that are then overlaid on the impact that has on our teams when they come to work. And of course, all of that falls on the shoulders of the leaders of those teams who have always been busy and have had challenges. But I feel like that's kind of going up a notch. And then it puts the additional weight and pressure then on our leaders that have to get everyone together, collaborating, get this cohesiveness and this effectiveness going throughout their team, all in the midst of the environment that we find ourselves right now. And I think it was the World Economic Forum had called it, because of all these separate things going on, called it a polycrisis. You add to that the world wars, climate change. There's so many different things happening at the moment globally that the name they've given it is polycrisis. And this is the environment that we have to lead through whilst having high performing teams at the same time. What are some of the success strategies in the work that you do that leaders can really lean on to create high performing teams? Because it's changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. As soon as our context changes, and as you just pointed out, there are, I think in the past, leaders maybe had a couple of change things to work through and their teams. Whereas now, it's the perfect storm, isn't it? There's change everywhere. And so it's juggling so many different pieces of change that is impacting everybody. Yeah. So that's really, really challenging. But it's been interesting. I think ultimately, in a lot of conversations I've been having with leaders about how to navigate and maybe how to lessen some of that anxiety and that uncertainty for their team members. You cannot beat a good old conversation, I say. There's no magical tool necessarily. There can be. However, number one, have conversations with your team members. I was talking with a leader just last week, actually, and he was talking about the fact he's got a number of different team members who don't really, change is not their most favorite thing. And so we were having conversations about they're in a unusual situation where they've got people located in all different areas because their building's being renovated at the moment. And so they're not together as much as they were. Some are just working from home, others are coming into sort of an office environment, but it's a shared, it's a hot desking kind of situation, largely. And so we were having a conversation around, first, even just check in with each of your team members. How do you find working in whatever location you're in right now? Where do you find yourself your most productive? What's your most creative workspace? Is it at home? Is it actually coming into the office on those days? Is it going to a cafe? What is it? But actually delving in and having conversations around that particular team member's work environment, what works best for them, where they're struggling maybe, and how that lines up with whatever it is that they have to get done that week. What are the outcomes they need to produce for that week? So yeah, I don't think you can beat that. I think a lot of leaders feel, because they carry that title of leader, that they have to go into this knowing all the answers and having all the solutions themselves. And no, you don't. Have conversations with your individual team members about their situation, their context, and bring the whole team together and have conversations around, hey guys, we've got this unusual landscape for the next however long, 12 months, whatever it might be. Could be forever for some, but anyway, if it's 12 months, and have that conversation about, okay, so how are we going to work together as a team now? What's important to us? What do we need to have in place? And just, look at it not only from a work perspective, but a social and connection perspective, a well-being perspective, kind of have some general conversations, and together collectively come up with something that's going to work best for everyone.
Yeah.
They would be some of my key tips to get started with that don't cost you anything. It's just a conversation.
Yeah. And I think often, particularly as the world gets more complex, I think often we forget the simplicity of the things that work. It's almost like a back to basics approach. And some of that stuff is so powerful, especially in a world full of change, especially in a world full of complexity. And I love what you were talking about there around curiosity and asking others, because I think I have this thing that like we're all experts because we've all got expertise in something, right? No matter what your role is in the organization, but we're always all beginners. So there's that kind of dichotomy of like you're an expert, but you're also a beginner at exactly the same time. And no matter how much of an expert we get in something, it pays to always be a beginner or have that beginner's mindset, because then we're curious. We're asking questions, we're listening to others. And I think sometimes you're right, leaders do have this pressure. I've got to be the one that makes all the calls, knows all the answers, carries people through all of these events. And like you said, one of the most effective things we can do is actually ask others for their thoughts, for their opinions. And that way we get more diversity of thought. We're role modeling inclusive leadership, and it gives us a better outcome as a result as well. And I think for so many leaders, just that relief that I don't have to show up and be the expert all the time. And yet it takes courage, right, to be in that space of, actually, I'm going to throw this over to you and ask you what you think. Yes, I've got an opinion, but you might have a better one. And I think that can be a vulnerable place to be in, but that curiosity that leads us into asking more questions and listening and collecting a more diverse thought and experience can uncover some expertise that we don't actually possess, even if we've been in the job for 30 years, right? And I love that approach, particularly to when things have changed, because this has never happened before, right? We've never been in 2024 with all that's gone on beforehand that's got us here to be able to look at the playbook and go, ah, yes, this is what we need to do. It's almost like a new era that we're having to adapt and evolve. And you're right, some of us are better at adapting and evolving than others. We are creatures of certainty, right? That's where we feel most comfortable. So, what's your advice for leaders and their teams that are going through change at the moment in terms of how they best manage that or how they keep performing despite some of the disruption that might be happening?
Yeah, yeah. Well, definitely do the conversation thing. I would always start there. That's a good place to start. For some teams, it depends what the challenges are that they're experiencing. Some of the work I get to do with some teams, as you know, Jess, and for anyone who's listening out there, I do a lot of measurement. I'm a firm believer in getting clarity through diagnostics around what's really going on, especially in these busy times. We don't have time to spin our wheels. So let's get some data in and let's really understand where we're at right now. Take a photo, or so to speak, of where we are at the moment. And I think there's two areas for teams that become interesting for them, depending on what the challenges that are going on for them. It could be around just the team makeup and dynamics. You know, what does our collective kind of team profile, so to speak, look like? You know, so that would be our collective strengths, our collective derailers or blind spots, our collective motives, values, preferences, those types of things. Because when we understand what those are, and if a number of us hold really similar ones, that can become an anchor for the team. So that's going to start to create the culture of our team. It's going to tell us how we might be approaching and delivering on strategy or not. It will tell us about how we're achieving results and that kind of thing. So that's really useful to understand. The other area, the second area that we can also measure is, how is my team tracking along the lines of the key components of a high-performing team? Because teams aren't broken, you know, it's really useful to measure and kind of go, how are we tracking? Because we feel like there might be some areas we could improve on, but what are those? So by measuring that kind of thing, we get a really good sense of what are we just naturally really good at as a team, you know, against those components of a high-performance team. And where do our opportunities lie to do some extra, you know, to zero in on? And, you know, measuring, first of all, make sure whatever measurement tool you're using is fit for purpose, and it's useful for the outcome that you're trying to achieve. But also, it just means that when you then are going to invest further in the development of your team or whatever it might be, you're targeting what you need. It's not that kind of, this looks good, or that looks good, we'll try that, you know, and we all know how those things can end out sometimes. So getting really clear, I think, to come back to your original question. So yeah, good conversations. Measurement is an option, particularly if you want to save time, money, and energy. But also, in your conversations with your team, be really clear on, you know, what is the purpose that we're trying to achieve here? What's the outcome we want to get? But again, you know, like you were saying, it's that collaborative conversation. Everyone can contribute. Everyone will, you know, has something to share with everybody else. They'll feel more valued. So when we go back to, you know, some of those challenges I was talking about in the beginning, around a lot of teams are talking about, you know, how do we maintain connection, engagement, momentum? When we have team discussions where everybody gets to contribute, we're building that buy-in as we go. It's not an end result. It's happening through the process. And that's what we want. And so when we talk about creating that shared identity, the way we do our teaming kind of gets us what we want in a very sort of under the radar kind of way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I love you kind of touched on the humanness of all this, the conversations. Yes, we've got to measure what's in the team, and that will be, like you say, a different set of strengths, experience, but then we know where we're at. We know
Yeah.
what we need. And we're all different, right, as individuals. And that's what I've always found so fascinating about teams, is you've just got a collection of individuals, often random individuals from different backgrounds, organizations, often countries, all pulled together for a specific reason. And then, of course, it changes as people come in and out of that team. The culture changes, the organization changes, the leader can change as well. And I
Yeah.
think, particularly in this new era where we're seeing like the evolution of AI being huge and probably this year to take off in a bigger way than it has up to date. And I think that some of our humanness and some of those human skills will be the ones that future proof many of our leaders, because like you, I believe that leadership is way more than just a title. It's not the thing that goes on our email signature that says manager or head of. It is how we make people feel and how we bring the best out of other humans. And I think there's certain things in our leadership journey that we will be relying on way more in the not too distant future, because there's so much of our technical skills that AI will be able to do. And
Yeah.
yet there's these human skills, or people skills, if you like, that we will need to leverage and rely on. And of course, we've always leveraged and relied on that to create high performing teams and to be great leaders. But I think that will be the case now more than ever as AI starts to infiltrate our businesses and our roles even more, as it's set to do. So, what do you see, I guess, in the when you've had examples of really high performing teams that you've worked with and the leaders that lead those teams, what are some of those characteristics that you could point to and go, yeah, these are the leaders for the future. These are the people that can create or cultivate high performing teams. What do you notice?
Yeah. First one is a lack of ego. So very humble leaders. They, a lot of humility. They're very collaborative. They're very curious. And their focus and attention is not just on the task or the thing, project, or whatever it be that we're trying to achieve as a team, but they are really focused in how the team actually does that together, and is everybody on board. So kind of, they're very good at building trust. They're very good at making sure that there's clarity around not only the results, but how we work as a team. I find it really interesting that, what was about the 70s, I think, late 60s, where teams became the big thing, right? And so, but there's not always a lot of development that goes into how to function as a really effective team. We throw people into teams and sort of go for it. And if you're the leader, whoa, you're lucky, because now you've inherited these people and off you go do your best. And so I think there's an opportunity to equip our leaders, but also our teams, a lot more, so that they really understand what being part of a high performing team means, what it means for them personally, but what it means for the collective, and how we can work better together. So yeah, I think there's it's really interesting times. I think for the organizations that don't start doing this stuff now, it's just going to get harder and harder and harder, and they're going to see more turnover. So equipping our leaders to be really successful, which is what we all want to do anyway. We want our leaders to be successful. And I totally agree with you, Jess. It's the service leadership model. It's about being of service to your team members. That's why you're there, and to help them be successful. And so the traits for leaders who are successful in this space, they totally get that they will be successful if their team is successful. And what can I do to help each of those team members be the best they can be?
Yeah. Oh, totally. And it's interesting because when I'm running workshops and I ask people, who's the best leader you've ever had and why? The constant things that come up without fail are all kind of the emotional intelligence, the egolessness, the integrity, the humility, all of the human skills that we're talking about. People never mention their technical ability. They never say, well, they were a great accountant or a fabulous lawyer. That never comes into it. And it just plays into this whole kind of position as a leader that, yes, your technical skills have probably gotten you to where you are, to got you the promotion, you inherited a team, but your job now is about how you help that team function to the best of its ability so that you can all collectively deliver on those results. And I think that's harder in a hybrid working environment than it perhaps used to be. Definitely harder in an environment of change, complexity, polycrisis, whatever we call it. And I think this is how we future proof ourselves as leaders for the future, leaning into some of this stuff and these skills. And of course, that in turn helps our team because it's always amazed me that you can, individuals can be amazing by themselves in terms of their skills and experience, but it's different when you bring them all together and try and mix them as a team. I'm a soccer fan, so I in the UK, when I used to follow my club, Manchester United, I was brokenhearted when David Beckham went to move to Madrid. But Real Madrid had they had this takeover, they had lots of money, and they had this approach to their football team where they were basically they'd got an unlimited budget, and they said we are just going to buy all of the best players in the world, and then we'll win everything. And they were
Mm,
called the Galacticos, and they did buy the best players of the world. They got them all together. They had one of their worst seasons ever. They had
yeah.
all this talent and they'd spent all this money, and yet the team, despite their individual brilliance, wasn't coming together. And I think there's something in that, eh? There's something around it's not just individual brilliance as a leader or as a team member, it's how that collaborates, connects, and how we nurture some of that talent. And that creates the culture, right, of the team and ultimately its success.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of also, the Ted Lasso, um,
Yeah.
series on Apple TV. Another perfect example, right? We can all have our exceptional high performing individuals in our teams. And if we don't nurture sort of the environment for them, help them become more aware, I guess, context around teaming and working all together, you know, that it might not work out that well. So I loved that series actually. It was a great way of demonstrating, it's the simple conversations. It's.
Yeah, and how you make people feel, eh? I mean, for anybody that's not seen it, Ted Lasso is a must watch. It's such a heartwarming, uplifting series to watch as well, which is unusual in its current climate, right? What we normally get on our platforms. But yeah, a real insight into some of this human stuff that we're talking about and the impact that it has on a team.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think too, what that's a good example of is, back in the day, most leaders were promoted because of their technical expertise, as you mentioned before. And those days are kind of gone. We need to have leaders who are good people leaders. They get the people leadership stuff. They have time to do that stuff. I think sometimes in New Zealand here, because we all wear lots of different hats and we're, again, caught up in all the busyness. But we can expect our leaders to be having to do a lot of the doing as well as the leading. And unfortunately, it seems to be the leading piece that kind of generally gets left behind. I know that's a generalization and there are always exceptions to the rule. But yeah, it's interesting, because going back to Ted Lasso, he knew nothing about the game of soccer or football, whichever you call it.
Yeah.
He came from, I think it was American football, so completely different. But what he was able to do with the players in that team was quite exceptional.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that. I mean, I find myself when I'm coaching leaders, I find myself constantly saying, particularly if they've moved into a new industry, you're not there to know everything about that industry because some of your team have been there 20 years. They know all about the industry. You don't need to know as much as them. Your job is to lead them. And that's a beautiful example.
Yeah.
Deb, it's always fabulous to chat to you. Appreciate your time today, and would love to chat more. We'll get the opportunity to chat more as well. But yeah, for now, give us your website address for people. I'll pop it on the notes as well. But for people looking to find out who is this Deb Bailey, where can they go?
Yeah, sure. So deb-bailey.com.
Fabulous, awesome. Thank you so much, Deb. Lovely to chat.
Thanks. And you take care.